Hey guys, my name is Colton Rosa, and welcome back to Seraphim Stories. Now today I wanted to talk about genre. Now genre is an essential part of fiction and something I think about often as an author. There are 8 major categories within the world of fiction. And even though there's other genres like young adult and action adventure that I could be talking about today, I specifically wanted to focus on the 8 major genres and not only what they are, but what are their strengths and weaknesses. So let's jump right into it with historical fiction. Now, historical fiction is kind of in a class of its own. It's different from pretty much any other type of fiction you could read because it's based to some extent on true events that happened. Now, authors will take a lot of liberties with how they tell the story and the parts of the story that they choose to tell. But they often have a guideline when it comes to what really happened in a given time period, in a given war, or a given situation that was important enough in the past that they think readers ought to hear about it, and readers would love to hear about it. Now, historical fiction has a lot of strengths, given that it can rely upon true aspects that people may have heard of before and may catch their interest. And it can also be inspirational knowing that someone lived through these types of experiences or something similar to them and were able to not only survive it, but act in a heroic way given the circumstances they were in. Now, because it's based on real events, there can be some downsides considering that you want to be true to the type of narrative you're telling. In a historical fiction, you need to be representing things accurately. You need to be doing your own research. You need to be taking a setting, like say the Civil War, and presenting it in a fair and accurate light. Now, you're going to naturally have some biases as an author, but you want to be more objective than you would be in other types of writing because these are real historical figures who had their own lives, and readers can quickly become dissatisfied if they think you're twisting too many of the facts or if they think you're not representing some of the people that were known and loved in the right light. Now, this is very different from the next genre, which is romance novels. Now, this isn't a genre I have a ton of experience in, but I do know that conflicted love relationships can be very powerful stories. They can be told in such a way that are easily very relatable because we've all gone through a lot of both the highs and the lows that the characters in these stories have faced. It's natural for us to want to root for people that are trying to find the perfect person for them and find the perfect situation in which they can come together. Now, often in these novels, there's a will they, won't they aspect that carries through most of the story, at least half of it usually, and they almost always end up together, obviously, because you want these types of stories in particular to be both heartfelt and tragic, especially toward the start, but then triumphant and exciting toward the end, where you get to see the payoff for the relationship that they've been working for so long. And one downside that I've heard about this genre is that it can be more specifically targeted toward one type of audience, which is true to an extent, but I think that if told properly, the right story in the romance genre can expand beyond its original audience and touch many more people than a lot of critics might give it credit. So the next genre is thriller/horror. Now, I've technically combined 2 genres here because thriller and horror are each their own category, but they're very similar in a lot of ways, and often the line between them is blurred at best. So, jeopardy and gripping terror are the words that I would use to describe these types of novels. And the reason for that is because they want to get you on the edge of your seat. They want you filled with suspense for every moment that you have to wonder who's going to win, who's going to lose, who might die, who might get hurt. You can honestly be scared often by these stories, and that can be a downside to them. But at the same point in time, when done in an effective and an efficient manner, these stories can be ones that no one wants to put down, because they want to learn what's going to happen to these characters. And the thriller/horror genre sometimes gets a bad rap because people say they don't develop the characters well enough for the reader to care for them. But that's not always the case. If you have a monster or a villain who's either surreal in their terror or very natural as someone we could actually face out in the world doing terrible things, then you can build upon that with your heroes who you're trying to keep alive. You can build upon that aspect of them recognizing how dangerous the threat is they're going up against. And I think that's one of the things the thriller/horror genre does really well, is creating a threat that's very real and you can feel it almost. You get those goosebumps, you get those chills just thinking about it. Now the next genre is interesting because it's one that I really love but have not yet considered writing a novel in, just because its strengths are very different from my own. And that's the mystery/police genre. Now once again, I've kind of combined two genres here just for the sake of time. But mystery novels and also police or crime-based novels have a very similar aspect of looking for the evidence, looking for the clues, trying to put the pieces together to figure out who's done the wrong thing and make it right. There's a sense of justice in these novels, trying to catch the perpetrator and put them behind bars. Or maybe they already know who did the crime, but they're trying to figure out how to show and how to prove that this is the case so that that person doesn't get away with the wrong thing they've done. Now, the reason I say it doesn't specifically go to my strengths is because there's a very specific way you have to write these novels. It's not as free or as carefree as something like a fantasy or sci-fi genre might be. Because in a mystery or a police novel, you need to have the entire story blocked out section by section, knowing what clues are going to come in when, how are they going to affect the story, which characters are going to affect the story, how are they going to pay off at the end, how many fake characters can you have as far as you think they're the criminal and then the plot twist is that they aren't. And this is something I would love to experiment with in the future, but it's a genre that, in my opinion, takes a lot of learning. It takes a lot of experience, trial and error, of learning from great detective mystery writers like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, and trying to figure out how was the reader satisfied. Because it's easy in a book or movie in this genre to not satisfy the reader, because either there weren't enough clues and they're left feeling empty because they never could have solved it themselves, or it was so obvious that everyone knew the detective was going to win in the end. Everyone knew the police force was going to put this person behind bars. There was never any threat of not succeeding in what they were hoping to accomplish. So those are my thoughts on the mystery/crime genre. Now, the next genre is pretty fun because it used to have a major importance in Hollywood. It used to have tons of novels, movies, and TV shows made about it, but it's actually lost a lot of steam in recent years, and that's the Western genre. Now, thinking about the Old West, you've got characteristics of survival, sometimes romance, often adventure, And stories can take different styles, but they've all got that grit to it. That roll up your sleeves and do whatever needs to be done type attitude. Now that can be especially exciting because it allows you to root for the underdog who is trying so hard to break through the barriers set up against him or her. But at the same point in time, the Western genre doesn't have to be defined only by gold diggers and cowboys in the Old West. I think a recent example would be the show The Mandalorian, which pits a Lone Ranger up against the sci-fi setting that he's in, trying to find a way to do it on his own. And he comes to realize that he needs his posse. And it can be easy to think, well, The Mandalorian isn't actually a Western. But you look at a lot of the tropes that Jon Favreau was using when he was directing this TV series, and it's actually pretty obvious that he drew a lot of inspiration from this genre, from the tools and the tricks and the weapons that a cowboy might use to outsmart his opponent, and even from the idea of standoffs and shooting competitions and many other Western tropes. So I think this genre still has a lot of potential, even if it seems to have died down to some extent. Now, the last two genres I want to talk about are personal favorites of mine because I've written novels in both, and I hope to continue with these genres. Now, the first, of course, is fantasy. My first 5 books, part of the Tales of Amcrinos series, are all set in a medieval fantasy world that I've created called Amcrinos. And these types of stories often involve kingdoms, universes, myths, and some combination of creatures or abilities or even magic. Now, fantasy can cover a wide range of stories. There's many different subgenres within the world of fantasy, and the same thing goes for sci-fi. I'm going to be talking big picture though. When you look at these types of stories, you consider things like kings and armies and princes, but that doesn't always have to be the case. There are even stories that take a much more simple approach to fantasy and are effective at doing so and don't need to have the massive high stakes of Lord of the Rings size battles or of massive dragons like the Aragon series. You can look at a story that's just a lot more down to earth, but considers a world that's different from our own. And I think that's a major key. Something that sets apart a historical fiction novel about the medieval times from then something that's fantasy is there's more at stake in the sense of there's myths or legends or special artifacts to be sought after and different elements that are different from the world that we know. Now, this can be done in a lot of different ways. It doesn't always have to involve a quest or a magic artifact, but there are a lot of tropes about this genre, and usually that's what they fall into. They fall into elves and dwarves and massive battles for the kingdom. Now, I don't want to discount those kind of novels because they not only hold something familiar, but there's a lot of room within those stories to build excellent characters, to spend a lot of time developing a world we've never even thought of before, to exploring new elements of warfare, of friendship, of character, of hopes that are worth fighting for. And that's part of what I wanted to channel in the Tales of Amcrinos series. And it also just allows you to take truths about the world we find ourselves in and put them into a new perspective with unique creatures, unique abilities, and higher stakes than we've ever imagined before, except in a case like a world war. But in these kinds of stories, there's not only escapism, there's not only a happy break from the world we find ourselves in, but there's real stakes that are higher for these characters than they are in most other genres. This is life and death they're talking about, or the existence of their very society falling apart because of their enemies. And there's a lot of really cool twists you can pull with that kind of narrative. And that's what I've really been trying to explore in a lot of different ways. At the same point in time, there are some fantasy genres we would never even think about. Like, at first glance, you might not picture Pirates of the Caribbean or Shrek or some of these other fantasy stories as part of this genre. But I think it all just goes to show that there's a lot more to this genre than meets the eye. And sometimes it gets easily stereotyped, easily put into a box. Now, the last genre I want to talk about is sci-fi. It's what I'm working on right now. And it's perhaps the most complex genre of all in a specific sense. Now, it's not as complex when it comes to the plot line, like a mystery is, or to the research, like a historical fiction is. It's the most complex when it comes to the technology, when it comes to the future society that you're trying to build, and when it comes to the aliens, if you choose to include aliens. Now, sci-fi is especially interesting because it probably has the most subgenres of all. There's everything from dystopia to modern enlightenment, where society rises above all its challenges and creates a sort of utopia on Earth, and everything in between. But the main overarching tie is that sci-fi talks about a difference in technology and in a future society that's unique, and possibly a perspective on where we could be headed, or a perspective on some type of life forms out in the universe that we never even would have thought of. So my personal sci-fi trilogy that I'm working on has the elements of a distant planet that is not on Earth. It's a planet called Centaurus, which I've created, and the colonies that are built there to try to survive. Now, it's interesting because it doesn't go as far reaching as something like Star Wars and Star Trek, but it does involve a vast amount of technology that's been developed and allows some of our heroes to have enhanced abilities to fight against the Lantinus, which is an alien race seeking to destroy them on this rocky desert planet. So I think what sci-fi does well is it gets us thinking. It gets us thinking about what is the world going to look like 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now. And it gets us considering what is the role of technology in society, but also how do we respond to it? How do we respond to others who are developing technology that extends well beyond what fiction could ever dream of? And it also gets us thinking about what makes us human, what stays the same throughout any time period. And that's something I would love to explore more as this series continues. So if you guys are at all interested in supporting me through the Tales of Ampkano series or the Sentinel series, let me know or follow a link below to check out my books. And give me any kind of feedback on your favorite genre, which genre you wished that I touched on this video, ideas for future videos, or even ideas for my books or for future books that you'd love to see me write. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.